Colleen and Mike Monfort were high school sweethearts. Literally, they met in senior year in South Dakota. And even as a teenager, Colleen was already an experienced diver. She was the one that introduced Mike to the sport, and to his astonishment, diving was just as enigmatic and addictive as the pretty girl he'd asked out for a milkshake. After school and the beginnings of navigating young life, they opened a diving shop in Michigan where they sold and rented out goggles, oxygen tanks, and all the apparel needed for serious and novice divers to get what they needed. In Colleen's 68 years on this earth, she'd completed no less than 1,000 dives in her lifetime. It's not just that she had more hours in the waters than most professional divers. Colleen was also highly experienced in just about every body of water, every set of conditions, be that weather or underwater currents, and she was in better shape than any of us could dream of being. They raised 2 kids, Kathleen and Robert, with the same passions for the water that they had. They saved every penny they made, keeping their lifestyles pretty humble so that they could afford to make as many international trips as possible, solely for the purpose of diving in as many reefs, caves, and historical sites as they could in a lifetime. The Caribbean, the Red Sea, the Galapagos Islands, Bikini Atoll. They'd been on dozens of trips, and this trip, taken in September of 2024, was no different. This week it was Indonesia, and like everything else they did, this was going to be epic. A whole 7-week diving tour of all of the best spots that the world's largest archipelago country had to offer. With them were 6 of their closest friends, along with a personal tour and diving guide to accompany them. 2 of their friends were a married couple, Rick and Kim Sass, whom they connected with years ago because they too owned a diving shop. Rick and Colleen had gone on hundreds of dives together. As a professional diver himself, Rick always maintained that there was no one he felt safer with under the water than Colleen. He always remarked that he'd learned more from her about keeping a level head than anyone in the field. It was what Colleen was known for, not losing her nerve or succumbing to hysteria, even when they were once stuck in a blind cave that had such thick silt clouds that they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Colleen's calm resolve was what saved their lives that day. On the 26th, the group set off for Pulau Riong, a tiny island off the beaten path. It has almost no tourism industry there at all, and it's too small to house a permanent population, meaning that those coral reefs are virtually untouched and pristine. The first 3 dives from their vessel went great. It was all just as breathtakingly alive and colorful as they'd seen in pictures. The group had 1 more dive left before they planned on taking a short break, after which they'd continue on to a different location at around noon. Mike and Rick were ahead of Colleen, with the diving master way at the front of the line, heading toward another vibrant crop of sponges, fans, and darting fish. But just as the reef came into sight below them, the dive master spun around and signaled them up urgently. The group were very confused. Everything seemed so calm after all. Nevertheless, they dutifully followed him up anyway. What they didn't realize was that there'd been a subtle but very telling change in the water. The dive master, who was farther down, was in a better position to notice. The fish suddenly darted down into the rocky crevices, like they would if a predator was close. The water temperature dropped by an almost unnoticeable amount, and there was a slight tug that the master felt dragging him down. Not hard enough to swim against, not even close, but just enough force to notice. No one knew better that these small signs were indicators of something bigger to come, like the calm before a storm, or how animals go quiet in the moments before the earthquake hits. And he just had a feeling in his gut that this was going to be an unusually strong underwater current. The creatures below had reacted with too much urgency for it to be anything else. Colleen stayed in place as the master went by and the rest filed in behind him. She was making sure that everyone got up safely, planning on taking position in the rear like she always did. Beneath them, the sand was starting to swirl into cloudy puffs. The beginnings of the current had arrived, just like the fish had indicated it would. The dive master got out first, hopped on the boat, and started helping the rest in. Rick and Mike both felt the first wave of the current buff against them before they surfaced, just hard enough to make them realize why their guide was in such a hurry to get out. When the dive master looked down, he could already see Colleen under the crystal clear blue. He even stretched out his hand in preparation for when she'd break the surface in less than 5 seconds. And then, Colleen, still looking up at his hands through her goggles, was whipped out of sight. All the guide saw was a blur of brown hair being swept away in a flash, and even the boat rocked with the sudden whoosh of power. One moment she was there, and the next, Colleen was just gone. Mike was beside himself, and the group had to physically hold him down to keep him from going in after his wife, before he got swept away too. Colleen still had half a tank of air. Chances were high that she'd surface in the near vicinity, perfectly calm and safe, like she always did. The question was just how far the current would take her. But their assurance was soon shattered when several fishing vessels and their own boat failed to locate her. The Coast Guard was called in, and before darkness settled, There were 2 helicopters in the air, but there was no sign of Colleen or any of her diving apparel. In the 8 days that they searched, the water just got worse and worse. The current that took Colleen was just the precursor for an out-of-season storm that came from nowhere. 2 more days after that, a fisherman 75 miles away made a grisly discovery. He pulled up his net containing an 8-foot tiger shark. Normally, he'd have released the animal back into the water without a second thought, but it looked unusual. It was moving too sluggishly. Its belly was grotesquely distended, and something just told him to have a look inside. Unfortunately for that poor fisherman, an entire human arm flopped out onto his boat's deck when he cut the beast open. It was still encased in the sleeve of a wetsuit and completely intact from the shoulder down. The flap of wetsuit was so large that it had caused a pretty serious blockage in the animal's intestine that it probably would have died from the blockage within the next 24 hours anyway. It was confirmed to be Colleen's remains by matching the fingerprints on the limb. But here's where things get strange. The strong acidic reaction within any shark species' digestive tract is so intense that there wouldn't have been any skin left on the arm after a single day of consuming it, let alone fingerprints still being intact. Meaning that Colleen had died on the day that the current dragged her off, and she'd been floating around out there for nearly 2 weeks, and this shark just happened to come across her remains, and probably several other scavengers too. And the truth of the matter is that any number of things could have killed Colleen. If the current held her under for more than 40 minutes, her tank would have run empty. Or more likely, Colleen took a few gulps of oxygen too fast as the water pummeled her around at speeds that cars usually travel at. This would have led to a case of oxygen toxicity. If the hyperoxia didn't kill her, then its effects could have stressed her body out so much that she had a massive stroke or a heart attack. Mike, Rick, and Kim refused to believe this. They all remained staunch believers that Colleen was much too experienced to fall prey to breathing too rapidly, or to allow a little thing like a current to stress her out to the point of heart failure. But they weren't in the crossfire of a stream going at 12 miles an hour, with unimaginable pressure coming in from all sides that forces the body downward. Imagine being inside an elevator on the 15th floor, and the cables suddenly get cut. The ocean doesn't just carry you away, it sucks you down as it flows. Unfortunately, you have to accept that she was nearly 70 years old, and no matter how experienced, how fit, or how outstanding her track record was, there's only so much that the human body can take. At her age, Colleen didn't stand a chance against the biggest storm the island had seen all season. Unfortunately for Indonesia, it doesn't matter how she died, since her remains were found inside a shark. This technically needs to be added to Indonesia's statistical data on shark interactions between humans. This is a terrible blow for them. The nation's been keeping detailed records since the early 1700s. In that time, there have only been 23 attacks by sharks, resulting in only 15 fatalities in roughly 300 years, a remarkably low amount by world standards. But at the end of the day, Colleen spent 10 days adrift, eventually causing her wetsuit and her body to be torn to shreds by more than just the current. So if we really need to designate a cause of death, then it must have been the ocean's final affliction. Trevor Percy Lancaster and his wife Cherry Rexton were a long way away from their home. The couple lived in Winchester, Hampshire, England, where Trevor was a very successful artist that drew heavily from nature, and Cherry worked as a complementary therapist that specialized in alternative healing methods. Throughout their lives together, they'd often take time off to go camping all over Britain and Europe. But until they'd reached their 40s, Trevor's son from a previous marriage and the high demand of their jobs prohibited them from traveling unless it was for work. So now, with Trevor's son James in his late teens and a better working schedule that allowed for a little more time off, they were finally able to travel outside of Europe just for their own leisure. And what better place to go than the untamed wilderness of Jasper National Park near Alberta, Canada. It was September of 1992, just as summer faded and fall settled in. Trevor wasn't much of a photographer, but he'd bought a camera just for this occasion, hoping to catch as much of the autumn splendor at Jasper National Park as he could. They arrived at the park entrance bright and early on the 15th and chose a campsite only 5 miles from the check-in point. Neither of them were expert hikers, so they weren't going to take chances too far away from assistance if they needed it. Unfortunately, their logical caution was all for nothing. Trevor chose a quaint little spot nestled right next to a bubbling stream. The trees were surprisingly thick for a place so close to the main road. Walking under the canopy of trees was like disappearing into another dimension where nature ruled supreme. Even though they'd gone camping many times before, the rented equipment was completely foreign to them. They struggled with the tent, fiddled with the gas stove, and got the sleeping rolls all knotted up. It was all in good fun though, and they figured it all out eventually. Their gales of laughter rang through the woods and bounced off the stream. Sadly, those sounds of joy were the reason that they faced the ultimate predator less than an hour after arriving at what was supposed to be their haven of creative inspiration. A young male grizzly bear started huffing toward the strange sounds. It was familiar enough with humans to know that they were small, slow, and loud enough to track by ear, and too young to have come to the realization that humans usually came with guns and roaring car engines. So it didn't quite have the self-control to walk away from a meal that could potentially be dangerous to it. Trevor was pounding in the last tent pin with a rock, and Cherry was on her way to the stream to fill a container with water when the beast charged into the clearing with no restraint at all. When it locked eyes with Cherry, sprinting at full speed on all fours, she screamed, dropped the plastic jug, and ran into the opposite direction instinctively. Trevor looked up, his frown of concentration turning into an expression of horror when he saw his wife of 2 decades sprinting past him, followed by the biggest animal he'd ever laid eyes on. To Trevor, the bear looked gigantic, even though it was a relatively small specimen by adult grizzly standards at least. But as we all know, a 300-pound grizzly is just as deadly as any other, and in many ways, this one was even more dangerous because it was young, reckless, and unrestrained. Trevor didn't allow his shock to keep him rooted on the spot, however. With the rock still held in his hand, he stormed after them, with no plan on what he was going to do at all. All Trevor knew was that his wife was going to die if he didn't do something. Cherry knew she could never outrun it, so she did the only thing she could do. She launched herself onto the nearest tree that had branches low enough for her to climb. But Cherry couldn't have accounted for just how close the animal was to her already. As she strained to pull herself higher, the bear pounced with perfectly aimed precision. One claw caught Cherry in the small of her back, and the other scraped the back of her head. The first claw went in deep, ripping through her jacket and into her skin. She was yanked off the tree, pulled to the ground by claws that raked down her back, her buttocks, and the backs of her legs. Luckily, the second blow didn't penetrate the skull, but it sliced through her scalp, cleaving out a chunk of skin and hair. Cherry hit the ground hard. With the wind knocked out of her and her entire backside on fire, she could only scream in agony. After falling from that distance, even the bear needed a moment to get back on its feet before it completed its attack. It got up, shook the leaves from its fur, and pulled back to pounce again. But something heavy and hard hit it on the side of the head, turning its attention to the moving figure on its right. It was Trevor. He'd thrown the only weapon he had at his disposal, the rock he happened to have in his hand. Trevor didn't stop to marvel at his outstanding aim. He bent down and scooped up some leaves and dirt and hurled it at the roaring animal, yelling and cursing to make as much noise as possible. And it worked. The grizzly changed course, instead focusing all of its attention on the man that was throwing rocks and dirt at it. It rammed into Trevor, sending them sliding over the damp ground and leaving a 12-foot trail of disturbed earth behind them. The bear proved that its aim was as good as Trevor's. Its muzzle closed over Trevor's head and its claws sank into his chest. Behind the thrashing body of the bear and Trevor's terrible screams of pain, Cherry began to crawl. She was heading toward the rental car just yards away. Every inch forward felt like the skin on her back and legs were going to tear her apart, and she was nearly blinded by the blood streaming into her eyes from her head wound. But when she heard Trevor's scream cut off suddenly, followed by the unmistakable sound of bones breaking and skin tearing, like the noise her husband's canvas made when it ripped, Cherry knew that she had minutes to live if she didn't get out of there now. She hauled her torn body up from the forest floor, grinding her teeth to keep her from screaming out in pain, and stumbled the last 4 yards to the car. Climbing into the vehicle was almost more than she could bear, but somehow Cherry did it without even a whimper. She could still hear the animal's feeding sounds from the car's open window, but she didn't look back. She knew Trevor was dead already, and if she didn't make it out now, his sacrifice to get her out alive would be for nothing. The animal looked up when the car started, but it was already dragging Trevor deeper into the woods, so it didn't bother chasing after the human that got away when it already had enough to feed it for the day. When Cherry arrived at the check-in point, the booth operators were already waiting in the parking lot. Cherry had laid on the horn announcing her arrival, and they could clearly see that the car heading toward them was weaving so wildly that something must be terribly wrong. Even so, they certainly didn't expect a profusely bleeding, badly torn up woman to fall out from the driver's seat. The two operators, young men barely out of their teens, called the incident in before loading Cherry back into the car. Getting her to Alberta themselves would be faster than waiting for a clunky ambulance bus to make the drive. And sure enough, they met the ambulance 25 miles from where they started, just 15 miles away from Alberta. While Cherry was wheeled into the operating room, rangers were deployed to find the bear and Trevor's remains. Trevor's attacker was found faster than he was. Rangers arrived, armed to the teeth and prepared for a long track to find the animal and the place where it had taken Trevor. But it turned out that they wasted their time packing lunch. The bear burst into the clearing where they were examining the blood trail and collecting the clumps of Cherry's scalp, ready to grab up another easy meal. Instead of storming onto another simple grab and dash, this time the Grizzly was introduced to the reason that its kind avoided humans. 4 rifles blasted off simultaneously, firing no less than 8 rounds into it. After that, finding Trevor went by almost as fast as it took to kill the bear. He'd only been dragged behind the nearest bush and was already missing most of his left leg. They didn't need to search for signs of life. Trevor's destroyed face and chest told them all they needed to know. Back in Alberta, Cherry received 2 skin grafts on her head where the bear had torn off 40% of her scalp. So many stitches that they lost count, and a pretty severe concussion. After hours of surgery and 3 weeks in the hospital, Cherry was finally able to go home to bury her husband. How could Trevor, who'd filled the world with so much indescribable beauty with his paintbrushes, suffer such an ugly fate? Trevor was incomprehensibly brave that day. He knew full well that in order to save his wife, he needed to willingly walk toward his own final affliction. The desert lions of Namibia are a strange enigma. Unlike the rest of the small country's estimated 800 lions, this small group of around 80 lions have adapted to live in the unimaginably harsh, dry, and uninhabitable Namib Desert. The Namib Desert is the oldest desert on the planet, and the fauna and flora there have had millions of years to adapt to their strange, barren landscape. These lions, that have to go days without water at a time, have adapted the ability to absorb the moisture from their kills in a much more efficient way than almost any other predator on Earth. The desert lions are prized, protected, and celebrated by Namibians for their unique and solitary existence. The group might be small, but they have a lot of support rallied around to protect them. One of those supporters was Bernd Kebbel, a 59-year-old local businessman and die-hard conservationist. Bernd had accumulated a great deal of wealth through his store that sold 4x4 safari vehicles and accessories required for camping, outdoor activities, hunting, and survival. But Bernd wasn't stingy with his riches at all. He didn't just support the desert lions, he considered them his greatest passion in life, and he'd given enormous amounts of donations to preserve their precarious existence. He was so influential in the movement that one of the biggest males of the pride was named after him at one point. Sadly, Bernd the lion was euthanized after he'd killed numerous livestock in the small subsistence farms along the northwestern coast. Bernd was now at the point in his life where he was taking a step back from running the business full-time. His children, Heidi and Dieter, were now adults, and he'd spent the majority of his life building an empire. Bernd and Connie were planning to start their early retirement by throwing themselves fully into their conservation efforts. Not just their beloved desert lions, they also supported the lone stand wolves. The desert elephants and the highly endangered rhinos of the Namib all needed their protection. And to get them settled into this new adventure, Connie and Bernd kitted out a 4x4 with the best gear, as much comforts as they could possibly fit into a mobile camping vehicle and even a rooftop tent to keep them high off the ground, where they'd be safer from the predators and reptiles whose habitats they were planning on visiting. They were going to start their retirement by covering the Namibian coast from north to south before heading inland to explore the rest. In late May 2025, they stopped at a campground that was an old favorite of the Kebbels, nestled right inside the Namib River. A point here needs to be made that most of Namibia's rivers are completely dry, without a drop of water in them, and Namib is one of those dry rivers. The Kebbels chose this spot specifically because they knew that this was an area frequented by the desert lions, along with 2 other cars filled with friends who were also involved in the same conservation efforts that the Kebbels were, totaling 6 campers in all. Bernd and his good friend, wildlife photographer Dirk Henrik, had heard reports of the lions looking extremely thin, to the point of near starvation. Namibia had recently experienced an unusually good rainy season, driving most of the game inland for greener pastures, leaving the desert lions along the desert coast without food to hunt. Just a few years before, Dirk had filmed a documentary that previewed at the Cannes Film Festival about one particular female named Charlie. They were searching for the pride specifically by tracking the collar around Charlie's neck to ascertain just how severe the season was for them. After 2 days of driving to the river, they arrived and set up camp. Since it was rather windy, they arranged their vehicles in a half-moon pattern to shield their fire from the whipping mountain winds. Only that fire was a beacon for the very lioness that was the star of Dirk Heinrich's critically acclaimed film, Charlie herself. The desert lions are so closely observed that they've become somewhat familiar with humans, enough to make them recognize that certain smells and sounds indicate that the hairless creatures that photographed them so often were in the vicinity. And Charlie, on the brink of death, saw this as an opportunity to catch herself an easy meal, something she hadn't had in weeks. The group ate and retreated to bed early. The wind was quite unpleasant, so there were no campfire stories over late cups of coffee that night, and none of these experienced campers had any idea that there was a lioness silently staring at them through the darkness. Charlie was watching, patiently waiting for one of the group to wander away from the safety that came with numbers. Even when they retreated to their rooftop tents, she still lay quietly. She knew that eventually one of them would come, and at 1:30 a.m., that someone just happened to be Bernd, who was just coming down to relieve his bladder. He'd gotten out of his tent, climbed down the ladder, and when he turned around from the ladder, the lioness was already just 4 yards away from him. He screamed once before she bounded on top of him, her teeth embedded into his head. Connie was startled by Bernd's first scream of surprise, and she heard the growls, scuffles, and muffled cries from below. She didn't wait for confirmation. Connie practically leapt from the open tent flap. It was a 6-foot drop down, yet she landed on the ground like a cat. When the other 4 campers looked out of their tents, they were met with a horrendous sight. A fully grown lion had Bernd's entire head in her mouth, her claws wrapped around his upper body in the most deadly feline hug of all time. And on the lion's back was a raging woman, screaming bloody murder and fighting tooth and nail to save her husband's life. Connie dug into Charlie's tracker collar, pulling a beast that weighed twice what she did, and hauled the animal off Bernd. Yes, you heard that right. A 130-pound woman bodily dragged an entire lion off her husband, fueled by a primal rage that can only be born out of pure love. The feline got to her feet like a whip, but before she could strike again, a metallic flashlight hit her over the head. The other 4 campers were all on the ground, all of them armed with random items from the camp: a pan, a flashlight, a walking stick, and a pocket knife. Together, 3 of them stormed forward, causing Charlie to backtrack, her muzzle dripping with blood and pieces of scalp. Dirk and Connie dragged Bernd into the backseat. His face was unrecognizable. His throat, cheeks, and scalp were absolutely ravaged to shreds. His shirt was saturated with blood from where the nails had raked through his flesh. Even as they loaded him in, they knew that those labored breaths were his dying gulps of air. They had no time to administer first aid because Charlie kept storming the camp, only to be driven off by the 3 remaining campers every time. When Charlie backtracked far enough into the darkness, they all retreated to the safety of their vehicles. Leaving their gear where it was, the 3 cars raced to the nearest lodge and called for help. But by then, Bernd had long since died. Conservation officers found Charlie still at the camp, chewing desperately on one of the leather boots that the campers left behind. She fled into the desert before the cars even pulled in. When Connie heard that there was a party sent out to euthanize the lioness, she and her children begged to let Charlie live. They'd been in her domain after all, and killing the starving lion wouldn't bring back Bernd, and their request would have been honored had it not been for Charlie's next attempt at an easy meal. She tracked another campfire in the general area and slashed a camper's tent, shredding his shoulder right through the canvas while he slept. Luckily, this unnamed man was carrying a licensed firearm and fired a few rounds into the night. A sound that Charlie understood meant that she needed to retreat. The man was able to get into his car and escape, but that was the last straw for Charlie. She'd now killed 1 human, attacked another, and had made it her specialty to seek out campsites with people. Her collar made her easy to track, and she was put down as quickly and humanely as possible. Bernd's death was not for nothing, at least. This incident reopened an old debate that the lion conservation efforts are outdated and in desperate need of revising. And the fact that local funding and the time and effort undertaken by Namibian civilians themselves, simply because they want to protect their ancient land and all of its wildlife, is an unacceptable expectation to have of the general public. Namibia needs to supply these programs with well-trained employees that have the backing of the authorities behind them. Connie has become somewhat of a local legend. She's the woman who fought a lion and lived, the woman who beat the fiercest feline in Africa by a strength that can only come from love that is as wild and untamed as her opponent was. These encounters from the campers were terrible, yes, but it almost pales in comparison to the losses that the subsistence farmers have suffered due to the lions' indiscriminate hunting amongst their livestock. It's only a matter of time before it's a home or a child that falls prey to a pack of starving lions. We can only hope that Namibia known for its fierce protection of its wildlife, can prevent another predator from exacting its fierce, unstoppable, final affliction.